thanks for joining us today at Speaka's virtual event, Will ZEB Become a Verb? Today we're joined with Mike Hynes, the National Transit Bus Program Manager at CALSTART. Hey Mike, thanks for joining us.
Hey Becky, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Let's kick it off and just tell us a little bit about yourself and CALSTART.
Sure, yeah, thanks for the opportunity again. So Mike Hynes, like you mentioned, National Transit Bus Program Manager for CALSTART. So I lead our transit work across the nation. Been fortunate to work in the transit industry for more than 20 years. Got started as a bus operator. I kind of worked my way through the ranks and been fortunate to work across the country. So really enabled me to kind of develop a lot of experience working with many different agencies and many challenges they have. And then been fortunate to move over to CALSTART and continue to advance our mission of adoption of zero emission. So a little bit about CALSTART. We are a global consortium of more than 350 member companies. So we are working to expand clean energy options across the transit space and transportation as a whole. And really what we're able to do is leverage members, leverage companies that we work with, leverage transit agencies, since we're talking about the transit space, and really develop solutions that are going to be able to allow them to adopt zero emission, do so successfully, do so with cost in mind, and really give them the tools that they need to be successful as they continue on their journey.
What ultimately drove you then to CALSTART? Because it sounds like you had a path, quite the meandering path to it.
Sure. Yeah, meandering is a good word. I really love the mission of CALSTART. I think we really take a holistic approach to supporting agencies in developing solutions that work for them. So taking the knowledge that we get from projects, from our stakeholders, from our member companies, and adopting those solutions to fit this particular needs of agencies, while also keeping in mind that we have the ability to kind of leverage learnings from multiple different projects, from multiple stakeholders and multiple companies, and really apply those to as many folks as we can. So again, keeping in mind what's the unique needs of agencies, but also what can we learn from other projects, what works, and how can we apply those learnings again to make sure agencies are successful. I think the zero emission space is really important. I think transit in general fits an important need for people, getting them to jobs, getting them to education, medical appointments, leisure, and so to continue to work in that space while also doing so by adopting clean energy options. So it's cleaner air for the rider, for the operators, for people who maintain these vehicles, cleaner air for the communities that we serve in, and just kind of leaving the world a better place than we found it. I think that's an opportunity that we have here. And that was really important to me to have that opportunity to continue to do so. And, luckily CALSTART agreed to bring me on, and I've been doing it ever since. So again, a good opportunity.
This leads really well into the papers that you've authored over the past few years, and the data that you're collecting with CALSTART to share with the transit community. Can you talk about what those papers focus on and some of the latest findings from this year's paper?
Sure. So every year we produce our Zeroing In on ZEBs report, and it's an index of basically tracking the adoption of zero emission vehicles in the transit space. We also do them for school bus, for trucks, but for the transit space, we're really trying to how are we doing in adoption? Where are we funding vehicles? Where are we deploying vehicles? Where are agencies ordering it? That data does not really exist. There's no central clearinghouse for this information. So, CALSTART really thought it was important to get a handle on this, to see, how are we doing? How are we doing in achieving our mission? Where are the gaps? What are we working on that's achieving goals? Where do we need to focus efforts? And when I say we, it's really not just CALSTART. It's CALSTART, it's the transit industry, it's OEMs, it's the federal government, state governments. It's kind of a collective effort. But in order to do that and understand where we're at, again, we need to figure out, how we've progressed. And so what the report really does is it breaks it down at the state level of what those adoptions are, what agencies are deploying vehicles, who's planning for them, who's funding them, where they're getting the funding from. And it's really kind of a crowdsourced document, if you will, where reliance on transit agencies, state DOTs, award notices, you name it, to kind of pull all this information together and kind of paint a picture of adoption. one of the great things that we've seen is that we continue to see positive growth in industry. Last year, 12% growth in zero emission. We really saw a dramatic growth in interest in fuel cell buses. That's up over 75%. So the numbers are good. We certainly would like them to be better in terms of the pace of adoption, but the positive growth is really exciting. It really says that we're achieving goals, we're moving on the positive path. But I also think it's really important because it also shows that transit agencies are doing what they need to do to move the pace of adoption, that they're getting the funds that they need. They're using those funds smartly, responsibly. They're deploying projects that are, again, wheels to the road in their communities. And so they're doing the positive things that we want to see in this space. And obviously we have more room for growth, but the numbers are good.
What do you think is limiting the pace of the adoption? You mentioned that there's a positive trend and that's encouraging, but the pace ideally would be a little bit faster. What do you think is in the way?
I think there's several issues. I mean, number one, funding. Adopting zero emissions is not cheap. You're looking at vehicles, you're looking at infrastructure, you're looking at training, you're looking at multiple pieces that are needed to be successful. So, agencies really have to leverage funding that they have available. They have to go out and seek grants. That can be at the state level, that can be at the federal level. They need to look at ways that they can get funding to support these projects. They're working with utilities and figuring out other incentive programs that will help reduce the cost. But so it's really kind of a balancing act of figuring out what the direction is, what the cost is going to be, and then how can they go out and find those funds. One of the big pots of funding is obviously the Federal Transit Administration's Low-No and Bus and Bus Facilities programs. We've seen tremendous growth in the amount of funding that's available to us. That's vital. I mean, I think the Biden administration should be applauded for ensuring that there's that level of funding to support these agencies. But we also know that despite that level of funding, there's a large gap between what's being awarded to agencies and what their need is. So it really speaks that we need to continue to seek ways to find funding to support these agencies. And really, we're doing a lot of work with agencies to try to figure out, how can we lower barriers? How can we develop programs that kind of piece different funding pots together? So they can have multiple streams, which they need to do these projects. And so looking at that. And then, one of the other challenges I think we have is the industry as a whole. Unfortunately, we've seen the bus manufacturer industry. It's contracted. There's fewer manufacturers today than there were just a few years ago. So that creates a challenge. The OEMs, I think, have really recognized that it is a challenge, and they've been working with folks like CALSTART, with FTA, to figure out, what are the barriers for them? How can they improve supply chains? How can they improve their kind of procurement and their development processes to get vehicles out faster? And likewise, FTA, transit agencies, CALSTART, all the stakeholders are looking at ways of how can we kind of holistically look at this to make sure vehicles can be produced at a lower price point, be produced quicker, and get out to more agencies faster. So I think, the kind of key pieces we really see, if we're looking big picture, is funding, and then the vehicles and the equipment that is needed are kind of the two pieces that we are really focusing efforts on.
Sure. I haven't heard about the combining of different funds before. So it sounds like there's potentially a pot that pulls from a few different sources. Can you give an example of what one or two of those are?
Sure. I mean, if you look at there's if you applying for grants, there's always various pots and grants that you can apply for, but there may be multiple grants that are available to you, and quite often agencies may have to make a decision if I'm going to go for pot A or I'm going to go for pot B. And so looking at ways of how can we streamline the process, or how can we modify timelines, or how can we kind of look at different programs, if you will, and better align them so agencies have multiple pots that they can apply for, or they can stack. If there's an incentive from like Volkswagen mitigation funds, for example, can they take that incentive and apply it or combine it, if you will, with a state incentive that may be available. How can they again get multiple pieces of funding to support their projects? A good recent example is out of California with the hybrid vehicle incentive program, HVIP. How can they use that funding, which reduces the cost to the agency by providing a voucher, depending on the vehicle? There's a voucher that reduces the cost of the agency. How can they use that voucher as kind of the local maps that they need to pull together when they're applying for FTA low-no funds, for example? How can they piece those two things together? That's something CalSTART worked with the California Air Resources Board and FTA on for this last cycle. So California agencies, again, using that example, can piece those things together, have more funding available to support those vehicle purchases that they need to do to adopt zero-emission vehicles.
Sure. With the reports that came out in February of this year, what do you think its greatest impact is going to be on the transition in the next 12 months? Any findings that you feel will be enacted on, I suppose?
I think, depending on the audience, I think at the policy level, it's great to see in the report that the funding is supporting projects, that we're continuing the positive advancement. So I think that really lends to the argument that says if we continue to support with funding, these agencies are going to continue to develop plans to secure funding and adopt zero-emission technology. So again, I think that's really important. I think on the OEM side, those vehicles infrastructure, it enables them to really look at where these adoptions are occurring. Are they markets that they're currently in? Are there markets that are showing growth that, perhaps that's something they want to focus their efforts on?
Sure.
And I think at the state level too, since we're dialing down to that state information, I think it's really important to show, because there's state programs as well that are supporting these initiatives. I think that state level data is really important to show state DOTs like, hey, what you're doing in your state is working. Here's the positive data within your state. And so having that kind of detailed breakdown, I think, is really important, because you can look at it at a regional level. You can look at it obviously national. We can do the comparisons to Canada, what our brothers and sisters to the north are doing. But I think it provides a lot of options that, depending on what you're trying to accomplish or what you want to see, you can see how the numbers are affecting in your area, and kind of use that to kind of guide your decisions on what you want to do in continuing the push towards zero emissions.
Is there anything going on in Canada that we can learn from here stateside?
Sure. I mean, I think, Canada has done a lot, much like I mentioned, the Biden administration has done with providing funding to support transit agencies. I think we've seen a lot of push on the Canadian side to really look at the landscape of developing plans for agencies to adopt zero emission, developing incentive plans that they can use to reduce funding, developing plans that show that they can adopt at scale. Much like in the U.S., certainly we have agencies who are doing large-scale adoptions. LA Metro, Washington D.C., Seattle. We're also seeing that in Canada. So I think it's helpful to have those types of examples, because we can see that what's working in the U.S. also works in Canada. But also looking at what can we learn from other partners in terms of how they're doing their adoptions. Is it best to do it at large scale at a regional level? Is it best to use it as more localized? So I think that there's a lot of good things that are happening in Canada that also support the work that we're doing here in the U.S.
I'm not as familiar with the manufacturers of the buses. I know that there's just a handful that can supply to the U.S. But who are the manufacturers in Canada, and do they have more access to buses up there?
That's a great question. Obviously Nova Bus is a key manufacturer. They've done a lot to support the adoption of vehicles. So, large contracts in Quebec and supporting those agencies. I think, for example, I believe it's Quebec. I could be wrong there, but so you have Nova Bus. You have folks like New Flyer, who is also supporting agencies in the U.S. You have some European manufacturers have started to do some demonstration projects. Solaris is a good example in Vancouver. So market is a little bit different than the U.S., but I think it's also a little bit different in terms of smaller in the sense of the scale of adoption. It's a smaller. I don't want to minimize what they're doing, but it's a smaller need in terms of the number. So I think you'll see manufacturers focusing on kind of larger scale projects, is my sense.
Okay.
Whereas in the U.S., I think we're looking at, you've got an entire U.S. market, large, medium, small. It can be a little bit different business model.
Sure.
But again, I think that really depends on the OEM as well, and what their goals are.
Okay, let's talk about maintenance, bus maintenance, and we have a picture here of just a speaker stand that provides access to the bus rooftops. So this is where we obviously interface with the transit agency. Do you have plans to support transit agencies with data for training and maintenance in the deployment data? So like I said, we work with people needing access to the rooftops, and it seems like this stage of that transition might be a little bit of an afterthought for some agencies. Any thoughts on covering that in your research?
Sure, that's a fair question. I think we're always looking for ways that we can expand what we report on in the ZEB series. I think this year we started to talk about the infrastructure piece. Really, previous issues had been very kind of vehicle centric. We started talking about infrastructure. So I think we're always looking to expand on that. I think to your question, which is a great one in terms of how we can support maintenance and how can we support personnel overall, I think one of the key things that CALSTART does, and that FTA, to their credit, has really required if you're going to apply for like FTA LONO funds, is developing a fleet transition plan. And the plan, I think, is really important, not only as a requirement, depending on certain funds, like I mentioned, but really it's a guidebook, it's a map for the successful adoption to zero emission. And one of the key pieces in that is workforce development. I think you're spot on that, in years past, it's been kind of not so much an afterthought, but folks really didn't know how to direct their efforts or what they should be working on. And I think we're really starting to see that change. We're seeing guidance from FTA. We're seeing agencies really try to develop workforce development plans that accomplish what their agency needs. And we're starting to see other agencies, as a tribute to the knowledge share that exists in the transit space, we're seeing other agencies develop programs that are then being used by others in the transit space. AC Transit, Sunline, MTA has workforce development plans that they're working on. All these agencies are kind of developing programs that support their personnel, that provide the needed training. We're seeing apprenticeships come to fruition. So I think we're really starting to see in recent years, and definitely moving forward, that agencies are recognizing it's not just a matter of vehicles and infrastructure, it's a matter of taking care of our workforce. And I think one of the great things that we've seen recently in the transit space is agencies kind of really developing these stakeholder groups where it's not just we're not just asking the public about what they want to see in terms of these vehicles and whatnot. We're talking to operators. What do you think about this transition? What are your concerns? We're talking to maintenance personnel, the same thing. We're seeing apprenticeships. We're seeing labor be involved. ATU, for example, developing kind of programs that support their members and give them the training they need. And to add to that too, we're also seeing the needed funding. That's it, as you well know, being in the space. You need funding to support training, to support equipment. All the things that you need to be successful. And again, using the FTA LONO program as an example, now you can get 5% of your ask, which is a plus up, not a takedown. 5% of your ask towards workforce development. So, depending on the size of your project and what your ask is in your grant application, that can be a sizable amount of funding that then available to your agency to develop these programs and support your employees. So I think that's vital, and it's really a key component of the process to be successful. Because again, it's you can get the vehicles, you can get the infrastructure, but if the operators don't know how to operate it, if the maintenance staff can't maintain it or don't have the proper training, you're missing a key component of being successful in these adoptions.
Definitely. Oh, we've talked a lot about this, the hurdles for a transit agency to obtain funding and purchase ZEBs. Have you identified consistent bottlenecks in the system of funding or bus procurement?
Sure. Yeah. I think there's a couple of things. Obviously, like we talked about a few moments ago, that the funding is available, but there needs to be more if we're going to support everyone. And so that's a challenge, when we're talking about applying for grants and things of that nature. Agencies are getting that funding, they're using the funding to implement these projects, but we know there's more demand than there is funding. So, it's really incumbent upon CALSTART and policymakers and the transit industry as a whole to really continue to advocate for funding and really outline what the need is. So, I think that's vital. It's one thing to say that you need funding, but it's really important to say we need funding because it's going to support these vehicles, or it's going to support the infrastructure, or it's going to support the workforce. So having that information is really vital. So funding continues to be a bottleneck. And then, like we talked about too, the vehicles. We know we need to grow the market. We know we need to continue to support our OEMs with what they need to kind of lower prices, to produce vehicles quicker. And likewise, support agencies. I think there's things that we can do, and there's things in the works now for various stakeholders of lowering the barrier for procurement, lowering costs for agencies, and again, just kind of taking steps to make sure we can get more vehicles out faster. So again, funding and equipment, I think, are the two bottlenecks that we see.
Pretty significant.
Right. They're not minor for sure. But.
So this is a question from somebody that's new to mass transit, and especially I suppose coming from Montana, where everybody has multiple vehicles and we just don't have as many mass transit options. What is the conversation around car ownership and the demand growing or decreasing for mass transit? Is there any link, any trends, and is this a potential impediment of the spread of zero-emission buses?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's probably a whole other series, but I think one of the challenges we have is our goal is really to reduce vehicle miles traveled. And to do that, we need to reduce the reliance on the single occupancy vehicle. But I think in order for transit to be successful, and where transit is successful, you see that it works for people. Again, like I mentioned, it gets them to employment, to school, to doctor's appointments, shopping, what have you. There's many folks in the country who rely on transit and it's their only option. I think the challenge for us is to continue to support those folks with these needed services, but also continue to show folks that transit will work for them. And so continuing to develop systems that work for them. We're seeing agencies look at how can they redevelop around transit lines. They're developing housing that's close to transit. Again, nobody lives at bus stops, right? Everyone's coming to the service from somewhere. Is there adequate access? What is the built environment? How does that support them getting to and from transit safely? Looking at new modes of service, and that's one of the great things about zero emission is we can implement zero emission vehicle options into these new modes like bus rapid transit, which kind of mimics what we see in light rail at a much lower price point. So developing these new service models. Transit is one of those industries I think it's really interesting in the sense that it's always adjusting. The ridership changes, the modes are changing, and transit does a phenomenal job, in my opinion. Again, biased obviously from working in it for so long, but I think transit does a great job of adjusting. And it's an interesting time we're in right now, post-COVID. Ridership is climbing based on numbers that we see. But it's also been a time where agencies have kind of been reevaluating. Funding streams may have changed, plans may have changed, and so they're always balancing day-to-day operations, bringing on staff, bringing on these new vehicles, new maintenance needs, and what have you. And so while they're doing this balancing act, we're seeing them do some innovative things with providing service. And again, trying to build that ridership back, but also providing it to new customers. So that's traditional service, like I mentioned, and BRT, microtransit services. It's a mix of things. There's no one system, I think, that works for everyone. So it's a challenge for sure. We have to continue to show that transit's safe, transit's reliable, transit works, and that's a collective challenge for all of us. Again, in a nation that you mentioned is really kind of car centric. It's kind of almost in our DNA. So, but I think what you often find is that once you've shown someone that transit works for them, they are a transit rider. So developing those services that, again, meet their needs is really vital, because once you could show that you've done that, you've developed a transit rider.
So this is going to become a podcast, and it's going to be posted on our Knowledge Center as a video. Our goal with the Knowledge Center is to make workers go home safely, because they go to work well-informed and know how to access heights and overreach safely. So how can a company like us here at SPICA support your efforts towards a zero-emission transit world?
Yeah, great question. I think the biggest thing that's helpful is, again, that knowledge transfer. In the space that you're in, being upfront with what you're seeing in terms of needs for supporting staff to keep them safe, to give them the tools that they need, it is vital, because that helps shape the conversation in terms of when we're developing workforce development plans or developing these transition plans, because we can account for these needs. Like I mentioned, there's all these various stakeholders in the zero emission. You've got your operators, your maintenance personnel, your planning development staff, your C-suite, the stakeholders, the communities that we serve, and everyone kind of has a role in this. So I think it's really important to continue to develop, opportunities for knowledge transfer, to learn, what you're seeing in the space, learn from your experience to say, this is what we know works, or this is what we would like to see. So we can work collectively to kind of develop solutions, and more importantly, develop those solutions and then implement them. So I think that's the key is, everyone has something to kind of offer within this transition. But keeping those kind of knowledge channels open to, again, take the experience that you have and adopt it and implement it. Because it's important too. Agencies are looking for that information as well. As we mentioned, I think before, the transition to zero emission is often very new to agencies. They're looking at new types of vehicles, infrastructure, maintenance processes, training, all these kind of fun things. So I think there's a real need for experts and stakeholders in the space to have that knowledge, to make sure it's available, it's accessible, and that we're all willing to kind of share what we've learned and what we know works, because it's going to support this agency and then the next agency and then the next agency, and we kind of continue to build on these solutions.
Absolutely. What else is on your mind that we haven't covered yet?
Gosh, no, I mean, this has been great. I appreciate the opportunity, and it's, anytime we can get the opportunity to talk with folks in the space outside of the normal who we would normally speak with, it's fantastic. So I appreciate the opportunity. And again, I would just encourage that continued knowledge transfer. I think that's one of the great things that transit does, is share what's working, what's not working, what our challenges are. We can't fix issues if we're not aware of what they are. So continuing that knowledge share is vital. And continuing to have opportunities like this to have dialogue is really important. So it's a great way for us to learn. It's a great way for us to share the knowledge that we have. And hopefully it opens the doors for more stakeholders to get into this tent, if you will, of zero emission. It's a big tent. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of people who need to be involved to be successful. So again, I think the more people that we can discuss it with, the better for all of us in this space.
So before we hop off, where can people find the latest paper? And are there any other resources you wanted to shout out?
Sure. Yeah. So the paper is posted on our website, calstart.org, under the resources tab. You'll find the Zero-Emission ZEBs report, as well as many other reports from the bus team, from our school bus side, from trucks, you name it. It's really a great resource. And I would also encourage folks to peruse our website. There's a lot of great information on there in terms of working groups that we have to support industry, upcoming events that we have, and ways that folks can get involved. We're always looking to engage with new members and engage with new folks who would like to be members. Again, we're very membership driven. So ways that we can support folks. I hope that they'll give us a look and see how we might be able to support them and how they can support us in our mission.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Mike.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.